Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, we are back to covering The Boys. Mariah's sitting in the next room surfing on her MacBook Air. I'll be honest, it's kind of weird recording audio in front of Mariah. Anyway, so we are covering The Boys. In a previous video, I know it's been a little while since we covered The Boys because like we were moving and everything, but now that we're back into the swing of things, The Boys will return as it normally does every Tuesday. And actually, there's one thing that I want to add on here. So Locke Pressner said today's his birthday and he wanted a shout out, so happy birthday, Locke. And I actually was tagged in a tweet by the Page Crusader who had this really cool video called Page vs. Film Civil War. It reminds me of that old video series that I used to do called Film vs. Comics, whatever it is. Use that name, dude, if you want to. Just run with it. I'll probably never make those videos again. But in any event, the video was pretty solid. Make sure you guys go check out this channel down in the description. So yeah, The Boys. Okay, so in one of the previous videos, we had talked about how we got this kind of origin, right? But the origin only came from the perception of the legend insofar as how superheroes came into existence, so on and so forth. What this does is it gives us the same sort of scenario, but from the perspective of Greg Mallory. Now, for those of you guys who don't remember, Greg Mallory was the leader of The Boys before the current iteration picked up, right? So when The Boys series officially starts, the team had kind of been disbanded for some time, and Billy Butcher was going around and regathering the team and so on and so forth. Greg Mallory was the leader before that happened. And so for those of you guys who were unfamiliar, the way this played out is that the Boys had become a pretty heavy-hitting team, right? And we'll talk more about this as we sort of get through this, but the Boys had become super heavy-hitting, and the result is that they drew the wrong kind of attention. And so ultimately things popped off between themselves and the Seven, and then Lamplighter, who was a member of the Seven, killed Greg Mallory's granddaughter. But the result is that Greg Mallory kind of been hands-off ever since. And so in the last video that we did, basically Huey had taken off back home, and then Greg Mallory had been contacted by Mother's Milk to keep an eye on Huey. And that's why the two of them encountered each other in the first place. Now, that's kind of stated right off the bat. When Huey figures out that this guy is Greg Mallory, he asks like, why are you keeping an eye on me? And he says, because Mother's Milk asked me to. But the big thing that comes out of this is he really kind of starts to paint this picture that Billy Butcher is not who Huey thinks he is, right? And by extension, us as the reader, that Billy Butcher is not who we think he is, right? Because we look at Billy Butcher and we see him as kind of a pretty extreme guy, right? The guy's not totally off his rocker, but he is still kind of extreme. But we also see him as a guy who's basically fighting the good fight. The picture that's being painted by Greg Mallory is that's not really the case, and that Billy Butcher is actually, for the most part, totally insane and off his rocker, which I guess we kind of knew. But the overall gist behind this is that with the conversation taking place between the two of them, the clock basically winds back to the Battle of the Bulge, right? Now, the Battle of the Bulge, for those of you guys who don't know your World War II history, the Battle of the Bulge was probably the third bloodiest conflict the United States had ever been involved in, and I believe was the bloodiest conflict of World War II involving the United States. But essentially, it was the last major offensive of the German army. It was basically the Germans going for broke, right? It's like, if we don't win this, then we lose the war. And that's exactly what happened. But during the Battle of the Bulge, at the time, Greg Mallory was a captain in the military. And so that's one of the things to remember here is that we do have these huge amounts of time, right? Because we are talking after 2001. And so this basically means that this guy was a captain in the military, and then 51 years later still looks pretty young. Now, the result to this is that really it's just a byproduct of taking compound V, is it basically slows your aging. But the fact remains that during this time, ultimately, Vought American had basically started rising to prominence. Now, if you guys remember during the previous origin video that we did, Vought American first started making a name for itself by producing weapons, producing tanks, arms and armament, different things like that. The problem is that they were your standard American corporation, right? So cutting as many corners as they could and trying to mass profits as fast as they could. The result is that they created a whole bunch of really, really shoddy products and had their weapons contracts pulled. And so as a result of that, they seemed to kind of go under and nobody really heard of them for quite some time. This is when they basically resurface and suddenly like they have superheroes out there. Now, what they do here is they present a group that's basically referred to as the Avenging Squad, right? Now, you would look at that and you would say, based on the name, they're more akin to the Avengers, and to a degree they kind of are, but given the time period, they're really more akin to the Invaders, right? So Namor the Submariner, Captain America, the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond, and Bucky Barnes is really kind of more of what they are, with a couple of Avengers concepts peppered in, right? Like the Crimson Countess, basically the Scarlet Witch, but nonetheless, the team is brought in for the purpose of saying, hey, look, this is the next stage in warfare. And Vought American has shown up here on the field, basically saying, we've got these superpowered individuals, right? They can run really fast, they're really, really strong, so on and so forth. So much so that a couple of them actually managed to lift up the back of a tank. Now, the funny thing about this is that where Greg Mallory looks at this, he says, okay, so like from like a face-on perspective, right? For like a surface view, yes, it looks cool, right? They look strong, they look capable, they look like they can do all kinds of stuff. Here's the real question here. Are they bulletproof? Can they withstand all kinds of different bombardment from artillery and so on and so forth? And while it is cool, they're lifting one of our tanks, other tanks, German tanks, can weigh twice as much as these, right? So like if they're kind of struggling and it's all they can do to really lift up this one, as impressive as it is, what chance are they going to stand against Germans? And so as a result of that, what you also get is really the first indication that none of these guys are trained. Unlike Homelander, who was the first homegrown superhero, no pun intended, insofar that he was basically given Compound V in the womb and then became the most powerful superhero on Earth. These individuals were basically injected. Now, it wasn't as though the injections worked right off the bat. That's one of the things that we've seen, that Von American would go through and they would inject 200 humans with Compound V. And those who didn't go through these heinous and terrible side effects, they went on to become superheroes, basically, or at least superheroes as they're being managed and essentially paid for by Von American. And so because these guys aren't really trained, what ends up happening is a couple of them basically decide to fly recon. And while it is kind of impressive they can fly, the big takeaway from this is you guys probably screwed up. And when the question is asked why, it's because if you guys just jumped into the air and then took off and did some recon work and basically looked for the Germans and then found them, then what makes you think the Germans didn't see you and say, what in the hell is that? There's people flying in the air. Let's see where they came from. And then leading them back here to this entire assortment of soldiers who at the moment are not prepared for conflict. And so if the Germans come showing up on their doorstep and they're ready to march and they're ready to fight and they open fire, these guys are going to get caught with their pants down. And that's exactly what happens. That the Germans sitting in the bushes immediately open fire. And what you get is this bloodbath that for all the glitz and glamour of the Avenging Squad and what they can do and how powerful and capable they are, they get shot all to pieces, right? One of them flies into the air, gets hit by the propeller of a plane, gets chopped to pieces. Another guy gets run over by a tank. I mean, it's an absolute massacre, right? Not only that, because these guys were caught unawares, they're all basically slaughtered, right? So Greg Mallory is the only survivor left, right? He's the only one left alive. And so the result of that is that when he's there and one of the guys has really been cut in half and asks for help, Greg Mallory takes out a grenade, throws it at the guy and walks away. And it's just kind of like, you guys are more of a problem than you're worth. And that's where Greg Mallory's hatred of superheroes began. I wouldn't really say hatred so much as his distrust and dislike of superheroes began, because what he did is he kept one of the pieces of evidence that somebody said, Vought American consolidated, showing that Vought American had ties to the Battle of the Bulge. The issue is that in the aftermath of this, Vought American washed their hands of everything, right? And we knew that. We knew that's what they did. That Vought American, in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge and the way that a lot of things in World War II had gone south, they basically quit. They basically kind of walked away and said, okay, we're essentially done here. Now, one of the big things to come out of this, and really kind of tying into some real world history here, is that in the aftermath of World War II, we basically got the formation of the CIA. Now, it wasn't immediate. It wasn't really until the National Security Act of 1947 that was passed that basically created the National Security Council and the CIA. But during this whole set of events here, Greg Mallory was there when the CIA was in the process of being formed. But one of the things that had gone on is that there were particular individuals here who were aware of the danger, or at least the idea of Vought American creating superheroes and sending them out there. Now, when he basically kind of goes to this bit of an explanation about the spy game, he's really talking more about the United States and Russian involvement, right? Because after the end of World War II, you end up going into the Cold War, right? And the Cold War was, the reason why it's called that is because there was no actual war between the United States and what it was at that point, the USSR, right? We didn't actually go to war with each other. Instead, what we got were a whole bunch of proxy conflicts, right? So the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, the Vietnam War, there were a lot of these conflicts that were an attempt of the United States to expand its sphere of influence with capitalism and the USSR to expand its sphere of influence with communism. What this really shows us is the idea that the spy game was alive and well, insofar as Greg Mallory, what basically became the CIA, the spy agency of the United States, sending people into Russia only to find them basically disappearing and vanishing and so on and so forth. All that's really kind of background stuff to say, here are the things that he did as part of the early days of the CIA. But seeing Vought American for what it was and believing that Vought American was exceedingly dangerous, this all comes to a head when he reads an article in the Washington Post about how what Vought American has basically done is created something called the Crime Fighters Incorporated, which would later on to be, become known as Payback. But essentially it was a recreation of the Avenging Squad. The idea that it was essentially like Soldier Boy, the Steel Knight, Ladio, Eagle, the Archer, Manbot, Buzzer, Crimson Countess, all the people who were there during World War II. And as soon as Greg Mallory saw this, what he basically realized is that Vought American used the Battle of the Bulge as a test bed. Can this work? And then realizing their mistakes, essentially clean slated the whole thing, wiped any evidence of their involvement aside from that one little piece of fabric that Greg Mallory has. So nobody really seemed to know that they were involved, at least nobody on the public face, and very few military officials actually knew. And so then when they suddenly show up here with the Crime Fighters Incorporated, there's no one there to say, hey, that was the same group during World War II and that was a total catastrophe. Nobody was there for that. And so the result is that it really sort of begins to piss him off, because it gets into the question of, if Vought American screwed up so disastrously in that regard, how are they going to screw up now, right? Like how bad are things going to get now? And so what he started doing was making phone calls, started getting a hold of people, and ultimately ended up coming across, these various instances when Vought American American was still engaging in various arms and armament, things like that. Their guns were misfiring, so on and so forth, getting soldiers killed during the Vietnam War. And that was particularly important because if you guys recall the entire Vietnam conflict, that we ended up having the legend, that's where his first son died, and that's why he harbored a resentment towards Vought American, right? Because Vought American were the ones who were creating the weapons, their desire to cut corners, got his son killed, and he'd been working against the company ever since, which was a huge blow because he knew everything, right? He was part of Victory Comics, the comic book arm of Vought American, so he knew the true side of the stories and then the stories they were supposed to tell. But what he'd basically done is he had made Greg Mallory aware of a guy named Vogelbaum. Now, Vogelbaum, as you guys know, was the guy who created Compound V. And so the idea of Greg Mallory was, okay, if we're going to use the resources of the CIA to do this, we cannot make it look like the CIA is actually involved. And so in one of the most brilliant maneuvers ever, what he did is he leaked the identity of Vogelbaum to the corporate competitors of Vought American, knowing that if they couldn't get him to their side, they were going to kill him. And because of the fact that he couldn't be swayed to their side, they basically sent assassins in there, and then using the assassins, he tracked down the location of Vogelbaum, and then in turn basically killed all the assassins and then went to kill Vogelbaum himself, ultimately deciding that he couldn't do it. And so in order to use him as more of an asset than anything else, he kind of gave a couple of instructions, right? And this really comes off, hot off the heels of Dakota Bob, the vice president for George Herbert Walker Bush, who ultimately, of course, in the real war was president of the United States and was as well. The difference is that I believe Dan Quayle was the vice president under George H.W. Bush, but I'm not going to swear to that. But Dakota Bob ended up being vice president instead. And Dakota Bob, of course, ended up winning the presidency. But as the vice president, he was the one that essentially sanctioned all this stuff, right? Because nobody really looks at what the vice president's doing. Nobody really cares, right? The vice president, he's just an in-case guy, right? Like, in case something happens to the president, then the vice president will do some things. And like, he can basically sway the vote in Congress. And like, aside from that, nobody really cares what the vice president can or cannot do. But what this did is it allowed Greg Mallory to kind of operate to a degree of his own accord. And so working alongside Vogelbaum, what he said was, you're alive, the CIA knows you're alive, the government's going to try to use you. So make Compound V, do whatever it is you have to do in order for us to kind of continue this whole scheme going on. But when you make your Compound V, make sure it takes like 7 to 8 years to make one batch of it, and then make it just like ridiculously expensive, right? Like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, if not in the billions, so the government simply just cannot afford it, right? Because the one thing that Greg Mallory wanted to avoid was the federal government launching its own version of what Vought American was doing. And so because of that, what ends up happening is with Vogelbaum working alongside him, he ultimately ends up taking an injection of Compound V, which of course is how he gets his initial dose, and then it goes directly into Billy Butcher's origin. And Billy Butcher is kind of given to us as, from Greg Mallory as a guy who was in his younger days. We're not really given a whole lot about his history, which is to say like his childhood and all that kind of stuff. Not in the same way we are with like Frenchie and the female and Mother's Milk or anything like that. But basically he was a guy who had a grudge. He held a grudge against the Seven because of the fact that his wife had been by his presumably Homelander, and then the child she gave birth to ended up killing her when it essentially clawed itself from the inside out. And so because of that, what Billy Butcher really showed here was a kind of ability to operate in the form of espionage and spy tactics, but to also be exceedingly effective, right? Like he was very, very good at what he did. But the initial charter of what it was that Billy Butcher was supposed to do, and the initial role of Greg Mallory, was that they were really going to more contain and control the various superhero threats, right? It was this idea of, yes, there are superheroes out there. We're basically going to find ways to make sure they don't deviate too far out of line. And if it really comes to it, then we'll kill them, right? But killing them is a last ditch effort. But it was really more of like a reconnaissance sort of organization, a reconnaissance block ops wet work team, more or less, functioning as part of the CIA that really wouldn't have anything to do with anybody. From there, what it did is it essentially went into the post 9/11 landscape. And of course, as you guys know from the previous videos that we've done, when it came to 9/11, things went belly up. And the Seven, the various Air Force pilots who were going to shoot down some of the planes, they were called off, and the Seven stepped in only to screw the whole thing up, right? Like to bungle the whole thing, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people when it didn't necessarily need to. The idea was to use the Seven to show that they could, intervene in a time like this, in a crisis like this, and then kind of bring things to a peaceful solution insofar as grabbing the plane, bringing it back down to the ground, getting everybody evacuated, killing those individuals who were on board that were intending to inflict harm, and then call it a day. To demonstrate they could be as much a tried and true, credible threat to those individuals who are functioning against the interests of the United States, more or less, to bad guys, and then in turn also be like humanitarians. Because it didn't really work out, the dangers of the Seven were put in full force in showing that Vought American doesn't really care who they harm or how those individuals get harmed, so long as their own mission ends up continuing on. At the same time, because of Billy Butcher's animosity towards the Seven, building on top of what he'd seen the Seven engaging in, and the kind of recklessness that Vought American really seemed to display, kind of pushed Billy Butcher more and more to the edge, where Billy Butcher was really kind of recruiting the rest of the boys, and then the team itself began to evolve in such a way where it was, we're waging waging a war on the various superheroes who are out there. We'll kill them, you know, if we can get away with it. Otherwise, we'll use them for information. But the boys team as it exists now is not what it was originally envisioned to be. And that's really the way Greg Mallory kind of laments and regrets the whole thing. That in his mind, what he did is exactly what the CIA has historically done, right? The CIA has usually created its own enemies, right? Osama bin Laden and the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s is a perfect example, right? Backing the Mujahideen, holy warriors, teaching them how to shoot, how to fight, giving them weapons, things like that. And then when the Soviet-Afghan War ended, then it turned into, okay, all these people that we basically armed and taught how to fight now want to attack us, right? So creating our own enemies over and over and over again. You know, the whole idea of the history between the United States and Iran is a result of the United States getting involved and creating its own enemies. It's what the US has historically almost always done. And so because of that, Greg Mallory kind of looks at that and says, I've essentially done the exact same thing. I've created a monster, is really how he looks at Billy Butcher. And so it's really a point where the boys cannot be contained and controlled anymore, right? They can't be reined back in. They're too far gone. And really what Greg Mallory kind of hits at here is this entire thing is heading on a collision course, right? Where he sends Billy Butcher out to eliminate Vogelbaum as kind of the last bit of information there. What this does is it shows the idea that there's a collision course, right? The boys are inexorably on a course to face off against the Seven, and there's going to be a lot of people who die, right? There's really no way around that because Billy Butcher doesn't want it any other way. This is Billy Butcher's own personal war, and he's using the boys as a means to fight it. As a result of that, you know, when Greg Mallory really kind of spills all these beans to Huey, really kind of tells Huey about all these different things, Huey calls him for what it is. And he says, I think this whole thing of like some veteran, this whole, you know, woe is me and I made some mistakes, you know, and things are beyond my control now. I think it's just an act. You know, he's like, I think you're a sham. I think you're a failure. I think you're a half measure, right? You're a guy who wanted to get involved in an experiment and you tried it and it didn't really work the way that you wanted it to. And the result is that, you know, it's a little beyond your control and you just want to kind of scapegoat Billy Butcher when you could reel them back in and you could try to find a way to control them, but it's just too hard. It's just too damn hard. So you're just going to wash your hands of it and run away and call it a day, right? So he really kind of calls him a coward and a failure. And so what it does is it leads to Huey traveling back to Starlight and basically spilling the beans about everything and saying, I work for the CIA, I work for the boys. Our whole purpose in this whole situation is to track down superheroes. We've killed them. We've beat them within an inch of their lives. We've done all kinds of heinous things, but it's to basically push you guys and pressure you guys, put the screws to you guys to the point where you guys lash out and the world will see you for what you really are. But the problem is that with this being the case, when you corner a rabid animal like that, it gets violent. And that's exactly what's going to happen here, right? That's Huey's biggest fear, as a full-scale war is going to break out between the superheroes and humanity. That the superheroes are going to ally themselves with Homelander, and then in turn, because Homelander is going to see the boys as an extension of humanity, that Homelander is going to wage war against humanity, right? So it's going to be this massive global war between the superheroes and the militaries of the world, and everything is going to go to pot. And so the stance is we have to kind of basically try to find a way to stop that from happening. And so it's kind of interesting because it's the first time that you really get into like an actual directional plot for the story. The overall plot has been superheroes are bad and we have to contain them, you know, and that's basically been it. But now we have a forward direction, which is pretty legit. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. Okay, I want to give a shout out to Kyle B, David Joseph, Ben, John H, AJ, Matt N, Jeff R, John H, Lean and Mean, which is an awesome name, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, Joey M, Steven Z, Austin B, Adam K, and Genosis 916. Remember guys, you can send me messages and I'll run off whatever your message is at the end of the video, so long as there's nothing crazy. But if you want to put a message in there, send me an email, rob@robertjefferson.com, and if you are one of these people who gets shout outs, then I will tack it in there. And yeah, thanks for watching guys.